Joining us now to break down today's headlines is our newest analyst, Chenjerai Kumanyika. He is an assistant professor of communication studies at Clemson University, South Carolina. Hi, Chenjerai.
Hey, how you doing?
And welcome to the program. Now, spurred by the release of the CIA torture report, the New York Times has published an expose of what took place in the early days after the September 11th attacks, and how the CIA actually considered creating traditional prisons for captives from the Muslim world. According to the Times, the CIA considered a new prison system where everything would, quote, be tailored to meet the requirements of U.S. law and the federal rules of criminal procedure. And in fact, quote, the CIA's early framework for its detention program offers a glimpse of a possible alternative history. But we know that the agency instead created so-called black sites, where human rights were ignored and prisoners were treated cruelly, degraded, tortured, and sometimes killed. Meanwhile, the GOP-dominated House recently passed a bill to sanction the Venezuelan government for violating the human rights of anti-government protesters. Two senators have introduced a similar bill in the Senate. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro dismissed the move as, quote, insolent and, quote, imperialist. Now, Chenjerai, when I saw these two stories this morning, I couldn't help but pair them as an illustration of U.S. hypocrisy. Do we have any moral standing left to criticize other governments?
I think we have very little. And, you know, what I think is so interesting about what we now know about the early CIA framework is that it shows that different options were considered in this process of deciding how the war on terror was going to be continued and intensified in the wake of September 11th. And so what we see is that, you know, the CIA put on the table, looked at CIA legal analysts looked at the possibility of affording to people who were accused terrorists the same rights that American prisoners would have. People would be housed in military detention facilities, and that this was essentially rejected, and they decided to go with these black sites. One of the first of these having to do with, you know, Abu Zayd's imprisonment, and this is where this, you know, completely illegal and egregious torture took place.
And we'll have more on the CIA torture report after the news flash. Thousands of Palestinians are mourning the death of a high-level Palestinian minister who was assaulted by an Israeli soldier. Minister Ziad Abu Ain was participating in a protest in the West Bank city of Ramallah when, according to Al Jazeera, quote, an Israeli border policeman shoved and grabbed him by the throat. Mr. Abu Ain died soon after. Even though an Israeli autopsy maintains that he died from a heart attack, Palestinians see Israel as responsible. Abu Ain's funeral was attended by top Palestinian officials, including President Mahmoud Abbas and negotiator Saeb Erekat. Mr. Erekat warned Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that he, quote, cannot continue to have a cost-free occupation. Well, Chenjerai, tensions have been high in various parts of occupied Palestine, from the war in Gaza this summer to the clashes over the mosque in East Jerusalem. Do you think that this minister's death could spark a third intifada, as Israel fears?
Well, you know, I think that what Israel should pay attention to is what's actually happening in the U.S., because there's striking similarities where you have an activist who is, you know, we have the Reuters photographer who says that he saw this person being grabbed in the neck and struck by tear gas cans, and yet the Israeli government has not accepted any responsibility. There, we find that their autopsy report contradicts the joint autopsy report between Jordanian, Israeli, and Palestinian authorities, who, you know, concluded that his death was a result of this attack on a peaceful protest. And so what we've seen is attacks on peaceful protesters, and these sort of ability of corrupt government bodies to capture the legal apparatus has caused widespread protests in the U.S., so they should certainly be prepared for that.
And finally, in yet another sign that the movement against police violence in the United States continues to grow, medical students organized major actions this week at more than 70 medical schools, including Yale and Harvard. Dubbed hashtag White Coats for Black Lives, the action brought together students and faculty members, some of whom staged die-ins on campuses and even blocked traffic. Chenjerai, how important are such actions?
I think these actions are important for a number of reasons. One is they're bringing a wide body of support to these protests. And as we see different regions come into play, and we see, you know, we've seen athletes, we've seen students, we've seen high school students, now medical students what we're actually seeing is also different issues being brought into play. So with the White Coats for Black Lives, we're also seeing students, for example, at Johns Hopkins, raise the issue of health disparities as part of the larger social justice effort.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Chenjerai, for joining us today. Our newest news analyst, Chenjerai Kumanyika, is an assistant professor of communication studies at Clemson University in South Carolina. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
This is Uprising. We'll be right back.